It was just after sunrise when Arlen Breckenridge stepped off his porch for what should have been an ordinary day. The air was crisp, touched by the first signs of fall, and the mist still hovered low across the Kentucky hills. He packed light, just a thermos of coffee and a battered metal lunchbox, the same one he'd carried since the 70s. He paused at the front gate to wave to his 12-year-old granddaughter, Mira, who stood barefoot on the porch in her pajamas, brushing her teeth with one hand and waving back with the other. It was the last time anyone saw him alive. Arlen was 68, a retired school bus mechanic, a widower of less than a year. The orchard was his refuge. 32 apple trees lined in staggered rows on the back half of his property, just enough to keep him busy, just enough to give him something to tend to after Evelyn passed. He went down there almost every morning, picking apples, checking roots, trimming dead limbs. That morning felt no different. Except it was. By noon, Cynthia, his daughter, realized something was off. Arlen hadn't come back for lunch. She walked down the narrow dirt path herself, expecting to find him resting in the shade, maybe napping beside the creek like he sometimes did. But the orchard was empty. His truck was still parked beneath the rusted tin roof shelter. The thermos and lunchbox were still in the cab. Unopened, untouched. By 2 p.m., she called a neighbor. By 3, she was dialing the sheriff. Deputies arrived before sundown. They expected the usual, maybe a medical event, maybe Arlen had wandered into the brush. The orchard was searched thoroughly. Grid sweeps, calls shouted, boots scuffing through grass and fallen apples. Nothing. No broken branches, no drag marks, no footprints in the soft dirt, not even a cigarette butt or coffee stain. It was as if Arlen had simply stepped off the face of the earth. Then they found it. Sitting alone on a weathered stump near the western edge of the orchard, a single Red Haven apple, bright, clean, recently plucked, still warm to the touch. No other apples had been gathered. His basket was nowhere nearby. The sight of it, so ordinary, so small, sent a chill through Mira's spine when she was told. She remembered her grandfather's ritual. He always picked one apple first, the one that looked the most honest, he used to say. He'd sit on that stump, wipe it on his shirt, take a single bite, and toss the rest to the crows. But that morning, the apple was uneaten, just placed as if waiting for someone else. Search efforts expanded overnight. Dogs were brought in. Thermal drones swept the woods. Volunteers from 3 counties joined in. By the next evening, the orchard looked more like a staging ground than a farm. But the terrain was open, flat. Visibility is clear for hundreds of yards in every direction. There were no cliffs, no rivers, no chance of a slip and fall gone unnoticed. And yet, there was no Arlen, no sign of struggle, no note, no trace. Just a lunch that was never eaten, a truck that was never moved, and an apple that sat still warm long after the man who picked it had vanished. By the 3rd day, the search was no longer just about finding Arlen Breckenridge. It was about understanding how a man could disappear from a patch of open land with no noise, no warning, and not leave behind a single sign. The orchard stretched just under 4 acres, flat, fenced, and trimmed so neatly that anyone could stand in the middle and see to the edges in all directions. Deputies said the layout worked against him if he'd tried to run, but also against anyone who might have tried to hide him. Still, nothing turned up. Not a shoe, not a thread, not even a scuff mark near the stump where the untouched apple had been found. Search dogs were flown in from Tennessee. They sniffed his truck, the base of the stump, even the lunchbox handle. One German shepherd, used in over a dozen missing persons cases, hit briefly near the center of the orchard, but then circled aimlessly and lay down. It wasn't enough for a signal. No scent trail. No indication that Arlen had walked any farther than the edge of the orchard, and no signs he'd left it either. A thermal drone sweep later that evening gave investigators their first hope, a heat signature in a thicket at the back of the property. But it turned out to be a stray deer. The following day, a pond half a mile down was dragged just in case. Nothing. No watch, no wallet, no body. At the sheriff's request, they brought in a forensic anthropologist from Lexington to review the scene. She walked the property, reviewed the ground compaction near the stump, and studied the apple. It had no bite marks, no punctures, no fingerprints. It was just there, still warm when deputies arrived. The air temperature that morning had peaked at 61 degrees by 11 a.m. They estimated the apple had been plucked no more than 15 to 20 minutes before Mira's mother noticed Arlen was missing, which placed the moment of disappearance sometime between 10:30 and 10:45. Broad daylight. Early theories leaned toward a medical emergency, a sudden heart attack, or maybe a stroke. But if he'd collapsed, he would have been found. And it didn't explain why the apple basket was gone too. Arlen had used the same woven reed basket every season since 2004. It was a bit warped along one side and had a leather strap Cynthia had repaired herself. If he'd had it with him that morning, as everyone believed, then someone would have spotted it by now. But it had vanished too. Just like him. The possibility of foul play slowly crept in. Deputies questioned neighbors, family, even the man who did seasonal repairs on the Breckenridge property. No one had a clear motive. Arlen had no debt, no known enemies. He wasn't dating anyone, hadn't been involved in disputes. He mostly kept to himself since Evelyn passed, except for brief conversations at the gas station and church. Still, the sheriff's department quietly pulled phone records. No flagged numbers, no recent arguments, no evidence of a setup or a meeting gone wrong. The only strange detail was how clean everything was. Too clean. In most missing persons cases, something, anything, is off. A broken twig. A scream heard by a neighbor, a dog barking at an unusual hour. Here, there was only silence. Some in town whispered that grief had finally taken hold. Maybe Arlen had wandered off into the woods to join his wife. But that theory never sat right with Cynthia. Her father wasn't unstable. He was tired, yes. Quiet, yes. But he didn't drink, didn't forget things, and he still had plans to repair the western fence and start a new section of pears in the spring. He'd already laid out the irrigation markers. He was looking ahead, not backwards. And he'd never leave Mira. He told her that, every single week. After 7 days with no leads and no evidence of criminal activity, the sheriff scaled back the search. The orchard was closed off with caution tape. Cynthia left the gate locked and told Mira to stay out. The land, once filled with the scent of ripening fruit and the occasional bark of old dogs, went silent. The trees dropped their apples onto dry ground, unpicked. By the end of the season, the wind scattered the leaves until only bare branches remained. For the first time in decades, no one touched the harvest. And somewhere in all that stillness, beneath the soil or beyond the trees, was a question that refused to leave anyone's mind. How does a man disappear without making a sound, and why would he take the basket with him? The orchard stayed closed. Year after year, season after season, the trees grew wild, then brittle. Apples still fell in the autumn, but no one picked them anymore. Cynthia kept the rest of the farm running. Just enough livestock to break even, just enough hay to justify staying. But she never walked past the rusted orchard gate again. She wouldn't speak of it, not in town, not to neighbors, not even to Mira. When reporters came around that first anniversary, she refused interviews. When the sheriff checked in the following spring, she told him there was nothing new to say. Behind her voice was exhaustion that never lifted, a quiet strain, like something had settled into the walls of the house and never left. In town, the whispers outlasted the posters. At the diner, someone joked that maybe Arlen had gone Elvis, walked away, started over. Others weren't so light-hearted. One man claimed he saw headlights near the orchard the night before. A woman swore she remembered Arlen arguing with a neighbor at the hardware store over a fence line dispute. The neighbor denied it. Still, stories spread. Maybe Arlen had enemies. Maybe Cynthia knew more than she let on. Maybe Mira, just a child back then, remembered something she hadn't told anyone. Then came the sinkhole theory. It started during the fourth winter when a surveyor from Lexington came to assess subsidence risks across the county. He flagged a section of land not far from the orchard, said it showed irregularities, a dip in pressure under the soil. An old man at the bar said it reminded him of the hole that opened in '71, the one that took a mule and most of the back pasture with it. That story took off. Locals claimed maybe Arlen stepped in the wrong place. Maybe the earth swallowed him whole, but no hole was ever found, no collapse, no indentation deep enough to bury a man in a woven basket without leaving a mark. Theories drifted toward darker places. Some blamed the grief. Evelyn had died the year before, sudden, fast-moving cancer. She and Arlen had been inseparable. When she went, something in him changed. He got quieter, spent longer hours in the orchard. Cynthia once overheard him talking to trees as if they could talk back. Some said maybe he broke. Maybe the weight of the loss pulled him down in ways no one could see. Maybe he walked into the trees not to work, but to disappear on purpose. But that explanation never settled right with Mira, because she was the last one to see him. She remembered it clearly. His flannel was buttoned all the way to the collar. He was humming something soft, something slow, as he stepped off the porch. He looked back. He smiled. And then he was gone. Just like that. No sadness, no slouch in his walk, no tears. He looked like a man who still had something to do that day. She grew up with that moment circling her mind like a shadow she could never shake. Every time someone told a version of what happened, aliens, murder, madness, she'd flash back to that wave, that smile. She never told anyone, but at night, she'd replay the scene in her head over and over, wondering what she had missed, wondering if maybe it was her fault, wondering why no one had ever asked her what she remembered. 7 years passed, and with each one, the questions hardened into a kind of silence no one dared to break. The posters were long gone. The search parties had ended. Cynthia no longer returned calls from the sheriff's office. The orchard remained sealed off, untouched, growing wilder every year until the branches tangled above the grass like a canopy no one wanted to walk beneath. Then, without warning, the phone rang again. It was late spring when a hunter stumbled across a human skull deep in the woods, nearly a mile south of the Breckenridge property. It was weathered, stripped clean by time and animals, but intact. Just lying there, half buried near a dry creek bed that only filled in after heavy storms. The sheriff's office called Cynthia immediately. They didn't make promises, but their tone said everything. After all these years, maybe this was finally it. The skull was taken to a forensic lab in Louisville. Dental records were ordered. It took less than 3 days for the call to come back. The remains weren't Arlen's. The molar wear pattern and sinus structure suggested a man in his early 40s, Caucasian, dead for no more than 10 years. Another unknown, another case, another family's mystery, not theirs. Mira was 20 by then. She was home from college when the news broke. She sat across from her mother at the kitchen table and watched the strength drain from her all over again. It was like rewinding grief. Cynthia didn't speak. She just got up, walked outside, and stood by the orchard fence staring in. The next day, an unexpected visitor arrived. A retired deputy, Gerald Kirk, who had worked Arlen's case in its early weeks, showed up unannounced. His voice was slower now, more cautious, and he didn't wear a badge anymore. He asked to speak to Mira alone. In the driveway, with the orchard just barely visible through the trees, he said there was something that had always bothered him. Back in 2004, during the initial sweep, volunteers and deputies had combed through the orchard equipment shed. They cataloged every crate, every tool, every container, standard protocol. All but one item matched the farm's inventory records. A single wooden apple crate stood out. It looked new, too new. No wear, no staining, no farm ID stamp on the side like the rest. He logged it, noted it as unregistered, and was told by Cynthia at the time that maybe Arlen had picked it up from a flea market or had it delivered without her knowing. He let it go. But in all his years since, he said he never stopped thinking about it. Something about it felt off, deliberately plain, deliberately placed. After he left, Mira couldn't stop thinking about the crate. It had been buried in an old police report for years. But what if it hadn't just been a forgotten purchase? What if it had been used for something, carried something, or worse, someone? Her mind reeled. Everyone had always assumed Arlen had been taken, by illness, by violence, by forces unknown. But what if he never left the orchard at all? What if the question had never been where he went, but where he was hidden? She spent the next few days digging through farm invoices, old calendars, handwritten notes her mother had kept in kitchen drawers. There was no receipt for a new crate, no delivery confirmation, no handwritten record of anything unusual in the days before Arlen vanished. But the gap in the record said enough. Whatever had happened that morning, something had been brought onto the farm that wasn't supposed to be there. Or maybe it was supposed to be there, but not found. Cynthia refused to discuss it. When Mira finally asked her about the crate, her mother didn't deny it. She just said it was a long time ago and nothing that mattered now, but the way her hand shook as she said it told a different story. Mira didn't press further. She just watched her mother walk back inside, shut the door, and leave the orchard untouched behind her, like she was still afraid of what might be found under the soil. By the summer of 2024, the Breckenridge orchard no longer resembled a working farm. The trees stood crooked and half dead, their roots buckled and unpruned, and the fencing had collapsed in places like a long-neglected cemetery. Cynthia had held on to the land until her final breath, never sold a single acre, never allowed anyone past the orchard gate, and never reopened the space that had once made their family name worth something in the valley. When she passed that June, it wasn't just the loss of a mother Mira had to process. It was the weight of everything unsaid, everything left behind, everything the orchard still held on to. And it was hers now. All of it. Mira didn't want the land, not really. She lived 2 hours away in Lexington, worked at a university lab, and had barely set foot on the property in years. The farmhouse was sagging, the roof leaked, the barn had been condemned the year before. What was left was dirt, timber, and memory. But letting go felt impossible. Too much of her life had been shaped by that place, especially by what had never been found there. Arlen's name still showed up in missing person forms every few years, always unsolved, always unresolved. Even now, 2 decades later, Mira still flinched whenever she saw the word orchard on a street sign. 2 weeks after the funeral, a man knocked on the farmhouse door. He introduced himself as Wade Tolliver, said his family had once owned the land across the ridge before selling it off in the 1980s. He said he'd always admired the Breckenridge orchard and said it had history. Offered to buy the back 5 acres, just the section with the worst overgrowth, for cash. His tone wasn't pushy, but something about the timing didn't sit right with Mira. She told him no. He nodded and left without another word. She didn't tell anyone about the offer. Instead, she called a local crew and asked them to begin clearing the back section that fall. She told herself it was about starting fresh, maybe leasing the land, maybe just restoring order. Deep down, she knew it was about something else, about answers, about disturbing what had gone undisturbed for far too long. The machinery arrived in early October. The heat had finally broken. The men brought a small tractor with a disc plow, working slow across the wild patches where the roots had twisted like knotted wire underground. It was just after noon when the sound changed. The plow clipped something hard, something not root. The driver stopped, backed up, and climbed down. At first glance, it looked like a buried piece of metal, maybe scrap left over from old fencing. But when they dug it out, the shape was unmistakable. A rusted length of wire wrapped around the corner of what looked like a wooden box, a crate, sealed, waterlogged, and buried deep. Mira was the one who reached down first. She braced her hands against the wet soil, cleared the last of the loose dirt, and saw the wood grain beneath her fingers. It wasn't a produce crate. It had no ventilation slats, no labels. It had been built deliberately, solidly, with nail heads driven flat and seams caulked with what looked like wax and tar. There were no markings, no stamps, just a rough surface aged by 2 decades of quiet decay. And something about the way it had been hidden, so neatly, so precisely, beneath the root of a tree that would have been barely 2 years old at the time, made her stomach tighten. One of the crew asked if she wanted to open it. She said no. She stepped back. Her throat had gone dry. She took out her phone and called the sheriff's office, not the local one. She didn't trust that anymore. She called the county investigator's line directly and said calmly that she believed they'd found something connected to a missing persons case. When asked who the missing person was, her voice cracked for the first time. She said, "My grandfather." The dispatcher went silent for a moment, then asked her to repeat it. She did, word for word. The crew was asked to stop all work. The field was taped off. Mira watched as deputies took photographs, made measurements, and carefully lifted the box from the earth like it might fall apart in their hands. But it didn't. It was intact. It had been meant to last. and as they placed it into the evidence trailer, she stepped back from the edge of the field and realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in 20 years. Maybe he hadn't left the orchard. Maybe he had been here all along, hidden but not lost. Not anymore. The crate was taken to the state lab in Frankfurt under a sealed chain of custody. What had once been a routine plowing job had now become a crime scene, or at least the long-buried evidence of one. The box was smaller than expected, barely over 3 feet long and under 2 feet deep, heavy for its size, caked in mud and hardened soil. When investigators opened it, they found a mass of degraded oilcloth and cracked plastic sheeting, folded tightly around what remained inside. The first item removed was a corroded thermos, dented and split open at the base. Next, a shirt button, brass, flattened, still clinging to a piece of thread. Then, the edge of a flannel cuff, red and black check, water-stained and torn. Within 24 hours, the Cold Case Division had reopened the file. The original sheriff was long retired, but boxes of reports, photos, and personal effects were still archived. It didn't take long for forensic analysts to match the flannel to the exact shirt Arlen had been wearing the morning he disappeared. Mira had described it in her original statement. Cynthia had confirmed it during the first interviews. It had been a gift from Evelyn, worn only on cool mornings during harvest. No one else on the property owned one like it. The bones were recovered carefully, scattered slightly within the crate from years of weather compression, but intact. A full skeletal inventory was done at the lab. The remains belonged to an adult male, roughly 65-70 years old at the time of death. Height estimated between 5'9" and 5'11". No major breaks, no visible signs of trauma, no bullet holes, no blade damage, no crushed ribs or shattered vertebrae. Just time-worn bone, stained from decades underground. And one very specific absence. The jaw was missing. The mandible, normally among the most durable parts of the skeleton, was gone entirely. Not dislocated, not shattered, simply not there. Every other major bone was accounted for, but the jaw had been removed, or perhaps never included. And that wasn't the only detail that stood out. The left wrist was bare, no trace of a timepiece. The family had always said Arlen wore his silver pocket watch every day. It had been his father's, passed down from a line of Breckenridge men who had worked the land long before tractors ever touched it. The watch wasn't in the box, not in the shirt, not in the cloth, not buried nearby. Just like the jaw, it was missing. Detectives cataloged everything, even the type of nails used to build the crate. Long iron framing nails, not commercial brads or factory staples. The lid had been secured with 2 lengths of fencing wire twisted at the ends. The craftsmanship was makeshift but careful, functional, not sloppy. Whoever buried it wanted it to last. The crate had been placed in a hollow between tree roots that would have been young at the time, no more than 2 or 3 years old. The roots had since grown around it, enclosing it, which explained why it had gone undisturbed for so long. In effect, the trees had sealed the grave themselves. For Mira, the discovery didn't bring relief. It brought a kind of paralysis, confirmation without clarity. The man who vanished from their lives had been less than 100 feet from the edge of the orchard all along. He hadn't wandered off. He hadn't collapsed in the woods. He hadn't been abducted or taken away in the night. He'd been buried, deliberately, hidden with care, but by who and why remained painfully unclear. There were no fingerprints on the plastic, no blood, no tools nearby. But the location, the box, and the items inside pointed to a single truth. Arlen Breckenridge had died on that property, and someone had taken the time to conceal him there. The investigators were cautious with their words. No obvious signs of homicide, no ruling on cause of death, ongoing forensic analysis. But Mira knew better than to hear comfort in that, because the facts were now undeniable. Her grandfather hadn't disappeared. He'd been placed in the ground, and someone had chosen what parts of him would be left behind. The forensic soil analysis came back in late October. It was conclusive. The layering around the crate placed its burial within a narrow time frame, sometime in the first week of October, 2004. The same week, Arlen Breckenridge had stepped into the orchard and vanished without a trace. The depth of the crate, the root growth around it, and the stratification of the soil all aligned. Whoever buried him had done it then, and done it well. Not rushed, not haphazard. It had been done with time, with knowledge of the land, and with an understanding of how to let nature do the rest. The 2 apple trees that flanked the grave had been young at the time, less than 3 years old. The hole had been dug in the soft gap between them, later obscured by the expanding root systems and overgrowth that no one had dared touch again. For years, it had looked like just another patch of wild orchard, but it wasn't. It had been the center of everything. When the final DNA confirmation arrived, Mira read it alone in her car. She already knew. The lab results weren't a surprise. The markers matched Arlen on all critical points. The test had been thorough, comparing not just to archived dental and medical records, but to stored hair samples collected years earlier from his old shaving kit. There was no ambiguity. The man in the crate was her grandfather, no longer missing, no longer a mystery. He'd been there all along, buried in the same orchard he'd spent half his life tending. Which now raised a different kind of question, not where he had gone, but why he had never left, and who made sure of it. Mira returned to the farmhouse that night and pulled out every box, every folder, every receipt her mother had kept over the years. Cynthia had been meticulous, bills paid in full, notes written in the margins, but there was one file Mira hadn't looked through before. A small blue accordion folder with fading ink on the label, repairs, orchard. It held scribbled notes about fencing, irrigation tape, and brush clearing from over a decade earlier. At the back, folded in quarters, was a single receipt from a hardware store in Danville, dated October 2nd, 2004. 3 days before Arlen vanished, the items purchased: 1 roll of black plastic sheeting, 4 2x4s, roofing nails, a length of galvanized wire. The signature at the bottom wasn't his, it was Cynthia's. Mira stared at it for a long time. Her mother's handwriting, unmistakable, clear, looping. It wasn't a forgery, it wasn't a shared account. It was her, buying the materials that, 2 decades later, would be pulled out of the soil, wrapped around the bones of a man no one was supposed to find. She didn't know how to process what that meant. Her mother had been the one who stayed, the one who carried the weight, the one who locked the gate and never let anyone back in. The same person who insisted they leave the orchard untouched year after year, and who never once broke that rule, not even for her. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat at the edge of the orchard fence, staring through the gaps in the trees, trying to trace a version of events that made sense. Had it been an accident, an argument, something worse? Had her mother meant for the burial to last forever, or had it been born out of panic, an act done too quickly, sealed too tightly to undo? The silence her mother left behind now felt intentional, not protective, not confused. Chosen. Investigators reopened the case under the classification of undetermined suspicious death, but the lack of trauma on the bones limited what they could prove. No weapon, no cause of death, no confession. The statute of limitations on most potential charges had already expired. Even if they had found Cynthia alive, there would be very little they could do without a witness or evidence of intent. But Mira wasn't thinking about charges. She wasn't thinking about the law. She was thinking about the apple her grandfather never ate, the lunchbox he never opened, the crate her mother might have built with her own hands. And the way silence can stretch so far and so long, it becomes the only thing you know how to inherit. The attic was hotter than Mira remembered. Dust clung to the rafters like webs spun by time itself, and the insulation in the ceiling sagged in patches where rodents had long since burrowed through. She'd avoided this space for years. Cynthia had told her there was nothing up there worth keeping. But after what they found in the orchard, Mira couldn't take her mother's words at face value anymore. She climbed the narrow pull-down ladder slowly, flashlight gripped tight in one hand, her other brushing along the wooden railing as she reached the top. The air was stale. Every step creaked beneath her, but it was the kind of silence that felt earned, like something had been waiting to be disturbed. Near the back wall, behind boxes of old decorations and unused cookware, she spotted it. A cedar chest, scuffed at the corners, its brass hinges dulled with age. No lock, no key. Just a tight-fitting lid, and the kind of weight that made it clear it hadn't been opened in a long time. Mira knelt and lifted the top slowly. The smell hit her first. Cedar, yes, but also something else. Age, paper, grief sealed in wood. Inside were layers of carefully folded linen, some pale with mildew, some still faintly fragrant. Beneath them sat a bundle of envelopes tied together with twine, yellowed and slightly curled. At the top was a letter dated April 2003. The handwriting was familiar, though Mira hadn't seen it in years. Her grandmother, Evelyn. The letters spanned the final 9 months of Evelyn's life. Most were addressed to no one. Some read like journal entries, others like unsent confessions. Mira read them one by one, sitting cross-legged on the attic floor as light from the single roof vent cut across her lap. The tone of the early letters was affectionate, if tired. Evelyn wrote of longing for peace, of missing simple things. But the entries darkened as the months went on. She described Arlen's growing irritability, how he spent longer hours walking the orchard line, muttering to himself. He had stopped sleeping through the night. He'd begun accusing neighbors of stealing from the trees. Evelyn said she'd tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't listen. He kept saying the land was cursed, that it needed to be taken back before it took him. Then came the part Mira didn't expect. In one letter, Evelyn recounted a fight she'd overheard between Arlen and Cynthia. She hadn't wanted to write it down, but she said she needed it somewhere, even if no one read it. She said Arlen had struck Cynthia during an argument. It wasn't the first time tension had boiled over, but it was the first time it left a mark. Evelyn described her daughter crying outside the barn, refusing to tell anyone. She begged Evelyn not to make it worse. Evelyn hadn't. She kept the secret. And then, tucked near the back, a final letter, undated, unfinished, just a few short lines that Evelyn never had the strength to seal. She wrote that Arlen had made threats, that he'd been talking about selling the land, their land, and evicting both Cynthia and Mira. He said the farm was cursed with rot, that he was done watching it decay. Evelyn had tried to calm him, but Cynthia was furious. The next morning, Evelyn wrote, the two of them went down to the orchard together, just the two of them. That was the last line. The rest of the page was blank. Mira sat, frozen. The letter was brittle in her hands, but the words burned like they had just been written. Her mother had never told her this, had never mentioned any final argument, any threat, any confrontation. She'd simply told everyone she didn't know what happened, that Arlen had gone for a walk and vanished, but the tone of Evelyn's last note was clear. Something had changed that day. Something had snapped. At the very bottom of the chest, underneath the bundle of letters, Mira found an old rag, yellowed, fraying, knotted loosely at the edges. She unfolded it carefully, expecting perhaps more papers, but instead, resting in the center, was a silver pocket watch, cracked, blood-stained. The glass was broken inward, and the hour hand stuck between the numbers 3 and 4. It was unmistakably Arlen's. She recognized it from every photograph he'd ever taken, from the stories he told about his father. It had been passed down through generations. And yet here it was, hidden for 20 years, wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath secrets. Mira sat back and stared at the watch, the blood dried black against the worn metal face. This wasn't something forgotten. This was something deliberately hidden. It confirmed what the letters only suggested. Whatever had happened in the orchard that morning, her mother had carried the weight of it for the rest of her life. Not just grief, not just trauma, but knowledge, proof. Mira didn't know yet whether to feel horror or sympathy or both. She only knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Here is the fully expanded script for Confession in the Ledger, written in immersive documentary narration style. Exactly 1,500 words. Bayer tomorrow. The house was almost silent when Mira found it. She hadn't gone looking for anything in particular, just trying to sort through what was left after her mother's passing. The drawers of the old office desk were stiff, swollen from years of humidity. And most of what she pulled out was exactly what she expected. Farm receipts, old utility bills, property tax forms yellowed at the corners. But buried deep in the bottom drawer, stacked beneath envelopes brittle with age, she found a ledger. It looked ordinary enough at first, bound in tan leather with a faint crease down the spine, identical to the others Cynthia had used every year to keep track of the farm's accounts. But something about it felt heavier, different. She carried it to the kitchen table and set it down. The cover bore no title, only a faded ink scrawl in her mother's hand. 2004. Mira froze at the sight of the date. That was the year her grandfather disappeared. That was the year everything had changed. Her throat tightened as she opened it. The first pages were what she expected: careful lists of expenditures, line after line of seeds purchased, diesel fuel, maintenance costs. The handwriting was neat, steady, her mother's familiar script, controlled even when times were lean. Then, near the back, the rhythm broke. The ink darkened, the spacing changed. Instead of neat rows of numbers, the page carried only 2 words at the top, written with a trembling hand. "Forgive me." Her eyes moved slowly across the lines that followed, each sentence a weight pressing harder against her chest. It wasn't an account. It wasn't a record. It was a confession. Cynthia had written it like a prayer, not for others to read, not to absolve herself, but as though she was speaking directly to something larger than the world she lived in. She described the morning Arlen disappeared, not as a mystery, not as vanishing, but as the day everything came to a breaking point. She wrote that Arlen had come into the kitchen already angry. He had been talking for weeks about selling the orchard, muttering about curses in the soil, threatening to put the land on the market and force both her and Mira off it. That morning, he had said it aloud, said it was final, said she had no say in the matter. Cynthia tried to stop him. She followed him out to the orchard, her voice rising in desperation, her hands shaking. She begged him to reconsider, to think of Evelyn, to think of the family that had worked that ground for generations. But Arlen wasn't listening. He told her it was over, that he wanted it done, that she and her daughter would have to find somewhere else to live. The ledger described what happened next in stark, halting sentences. He grabbed her by the wrist. She pulled away, but he shoved her. She shoved back. He stumbled. His foot caught on a jagged stone that jutted out near the roots of one of the apple trees. His head struck it with a sickening crack. Cynthia wrote that she froze, waiting for him to move, but he didn't. She fell to her knees, tried to shake him awake, tried to lift his head, but blood was already spreading dark through his hair. The next words made Mira's stomach twist. He was gone before I knew what to do. The confession went on. Cynthia wrote that she sat there for nearly an hour, numb and terrified. She thought about calling the sheriff, about running to the neighbors, about screaming for help. But then she thought about what they would say, about the bruises she'd hidden before, about the whispers in town, about how no one would believe it had been an accident, how they would take the land, how they might take Mira. So she made a decision. That night, after Mira was asleep, she went to the shed. She built a box out of the new lumber she'd bought days earlier, the same lumber she'd told the clerk was for fence repairs. She lined it with the plastic she had purchased at the hardware store, hammered the lid down with nails, and wrapped the seams with wire. She dragged Arlen's body into the crate, covered it with oilcloth, and under the cover of darkness, she buried him between 2 young apple trees they had planted together years earlier, when the orchard had been something they still believed in. Her words were unflinching, matter of fact, but the weight of them was unbearable. "I did it because I couldn't lose everything at once," she wrote. "I couldn't lose the farm, and I couldn't lose Mira. He left me no choice. I'm so sorry. Forgive me." Mira closed the ledger slowly, her hands trembling against the worn leather. The confession was short, less than a page, but it carried the weight of 2 lost decades. Everything that had never made sense, the missing basket, the absence of a body, the silence her mother carried. It all came together here. It hadn't been a stranger. It hadn't been an accident of nature or a mystery of chance. It had been her own mother, making an impossible choice in a moment of panic and desperation. She thought back to all the years of silence, the way Cynthia had refused interviews, had locked the orchard gate, had never once allowed Mira to walk those rows again. At the time, Mira had thought it was grief, maybe fear. Now she understood. It was guilt. It was a memory. It was the weight of knowing exactly where he was and never being able to say it. Mira sat in the kitchen until dawn, the ledger open in front of her, the words replaying over and over in her head. She didn't know how to feel. Anger rose first, sharp and burning. Anger that her mother had lied to her for her entire life, that she had carried this secret alone, that she had let her daughter grow up haunted by questions she already had the answers to. But beneath the anger came something heavier. harder to name. A recognition of the desperation that had driven her, a realization that, in that moment, Cynthia had believed she was protecting her, that burying the truth had seemed like the only way to keep them both afloat. The authorities reviewed the confession carefully. The forensic evidence matched it. The fractured skull, the blunt trauma, the absence of any defensive wounds, the hardware purchases, the burial between the trees, the ledger filled in every blank. But with Cynthia gone, there was no one left to charge, no trial to hold, no testimony to give. It was closure without accountability, truth without consequence. For the sheriff's office, it was enough. The case was marked solved, the file officially closed. But for Mira, the case would never close in the same way. She could accept the facts, but the emotions behind them didn't file neatly away. She had to live with both, the image of her grandfather collapsing against the rock and the image of her mother, young and terrified, lowering him into the earth with her own hands. She had to reconcile the woman who raised her with the woman who had written those words in the ledger. She had to carry both versions of her mother at once. Weeks later, she returned to the orchard. The trees were thinner now, many diseased, their branches brittle and sagging. But the space where the crate had been buried was still raw, the soil turned and marked by the investigators. She sat on the bench she had placed nearby, the confession folded in her lap, and tried to imagine what that night must have looked like. A single lantern, a hammer, the sound of earth giving way. She imagined her mother's face as she covered the box step by step, sealing it beneath the soil. Not a criminal, not a villain. Just a woman who believed she had no other choice. Mira didn't forgive her immediately. Maybe she never fully would. But for the first time in 20 years, she had the truth. The silence had broken. The mystery was no longer a shadow over her life. And as she looked out over the orchard, she realized that while it had taken 2 decades and a plow blade to bring it to the surface, the story was finally complete. The ledger had done more than reveal a confession. It had given her a way to understand what had always felt incomprehensible. And as painful as it was also the only way forward. Because now, at last, she could stop asking what happened. She knew. And that knowledge, heavy as it was, changed everything. The case was closed quietly, with no press conference, no arrests, and no headlines. The medical examiner's final report listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma consistent with an accidental fall onto a solid surface. The injury matched a fall backward, consistent with impact on a rock or ledge. There was no evidence of foul play beyond the concealment of the body, and since Cynthia Breckenridge had passed before the remains were even discovered, no criminal charges were filed. The box, the burial, the silence, it was all deemed post-mortem concealment without malicious intent. What had begun as a disappearance, a mystery that swallowed 2 decades of a family's life, was now just a line in a case summary. Deceased, located, closed. But for Mira, the ending wasn't on paper. It wasn't in the autopsy or the forensic files or the folder marked Breckenridge Arlen. The real ending was quieter, heavier, and still ongoing. She sat alone at the orchard fence for days after the case closed. Not mourning exactly, but sorting through the weight of everything uncovered. Her childhood had been shaped by the absence of a man who never truly left. The silence in their house. The questions were never asked. The orchard was sealed like a room with no key. And now, all at once, the story had been cracked open. Not in the way she ever imagined, but fully. Enough to see every piece for what it was. Enough to understand why. She didn't want to keep the land as it was. Leaving it untouched felt like continuing the silence, and the orchard had already been quiet long enough. The trees were sick, too many years neglected, and the soil in the back field where Arlen was found had already been stripped and marked by forensic work. So she cleared the ground, but not to destroy it. She cleaned it up to make space. She built a small bench, simple, cedar, hand-finished. She placed it along the edge of the burial site and planted 3 new trees behind it, not apples, wild cherry, like the ones Arlen and Evelyn used to visit in spring when Mira was little. She didn't mark the spot as a grave. She didn't call it that. She just called it his. In early spring, she reopened the orchard, not as a business and not as a farm, but as a garden, one that belonged to the community. She posted a handwritten sign at the front, for planting, for memory, for telling the truth. She offered small plots to local families. She let the high school students volunteer to help reseed the soil. She invited neighbors who still remembered the headlines from 2004 to walk through the rows and ask questions, if they had them. And when people asked what happened, Mira didn't lie. She told the story, start to finish, not to accuse, not to punish, but to explain. She told them that her grandfather was a complicated man, and that her mother was a woman who tried to hold a family together in ways that the world didn't always understand. She told them that silence had protected no one, that secrets don't dissolve, they root deeper, that sometimes the hardest part of the truth isn't what you discover, but who you become after learning it. And she made it clear that while she didn't forgive everything, she understood more now than she ever had. People came, quietly, respectfully, sometimes just to walk between the rows, and some of them cried, not just for Arlen, for their own stories, their own silences, the things they'd buried, intentionally or not. And Mira realized the orchard was no longer just a place where something terrible had been hidden. It had become a place where something broken could be acknowledged and maybe even begin to heal. That spring, a woman left a bouquet of lilies near the bench. No name, no note, just a single line written on the wrapping paper. We carry what we don't say. Mira didn't know who had left it. She didn't need to. The plow hadn't just turned over dirt. It had ruptured something much deeper, something that had lived in her family's silence for years. It unearthed grief, yes, but it also unearthed truth and history and the chance for something else to grow in its place. And for the first time in Mira's life, the orchard felt like it was breathing again. Not haunted, not hidden, just open. What they found in the soil didn't answer every question. It didn't erase the pain or rewrite the past, but it gave her something she never expected to find. A beginning.